PM.
Am I visible and audible? Sorry, I was lagging.
Yep.
Okay. Just give me a second, I'll start. POI is wobbly. I won't be looking at the chat. Okay. Specifically in South, sorry. It wasn't recording. Specifically in South Korea, where conglomerates and major corporations retain too much power to be able to monopolize the working conditions, to monopolize the economy that happens within the government, but also significantly influence policy and the way in which politicians or technocrats surround their decisions around policy making. What we think, policy making. I want to very clearly frame out what exactly these characteristics that these powers, these corporations will be able to have. We think that what changes is also things like packages, things like salary increments, things like bonuses, or things like working incentives, like better maternal leaves, better evidentiary funds for you to retire, are likely going to be things that can be fixed in our side of the house. So two pieces of argumentation then. Firstly, we think we'll likely be able to shift a larger amount of accountability for corporations with too much power. Three characteristics here. The first is unions. Unions are super important to be able to lobby against corporations to hold them for poor working conditions because of their close connections and industry connections with NGOs, with major politicians and activists. The ability for them to be able to influence corporations are deep rooted and likely significant in our side of the house. This is significantly important, particularly in South Korea, because a lot of the working conditions, like we see particularly within the North Asia, are super excruciating, are super long hours that people don't have a decent life or decent work life, a decent personal life outside of their work, and they don't have any policies to be able to regulate this. This necessarily means the resources, the backing, and the political lobbying and capital that the unions will be able to aggregate and galvanize in our side of the house are extremely important. Therefore, you need to pass the act to be able to legitimize them, to be able to allow them to have that political capital, even on the policy and the political level. Second thing, South Korea is facing a harsh economy like every other economy right now. We see why the Korean index has significantly fallen. We see why their large conglomerate like Samsung is necessarily also struggling in terms of their year-on-year profit, which means that we're likely going to see a large wave of restructuring in terms of employment, in terms of like involuntary like basically fire, and with no pension, with no compensation for firing you or restructuring you up, which necessarily means because of the incentives to stay on top of their profits, to stay on top of their revenues, they're likely going to treat the workers, not allowing them to have proper compensation, not allowing a gradual transition to get out of their jobs, therefore creating a lot of these like economic shock within the market. But thirdly, we're likely going to get better uproars in our side of the house for the very reason because when it's on a policy level, on an act, you have things like unions. When you have things like political disputes within the parliament, you're likely going to see a larger uproar in the things you're going to hold them accountable for. It looks like share prices going down. It looks like the whole company as a whole, rather than scapegoating a single employer, a single manager for things like fraud, for things like corruption, for things like mismanagement of the corporation. And we think that kind of economic shock and uproar that you will be able to get exclusively because you have this act is something that's largely magnified inside of OG. Why is this important? Because of the things of corruption, things like corruption, things like managerial issues, or things like poor labor conditions with limited ability for you to be able to dispute the poor working conditions are likely going to be silenced in the other side of the house. Things like arbitration, things like settlements, which are likely things like arbitration and things like settlements, which are likely going to censor all those people who do not have the political capital, who do not have the platform, and do not have the ability to be able to penetrate or basically hold them accountable, don't have the tool in the toolbox to hold them accountable. What is the comparative? We think it's fivefold here. We think firstly, we're likely going to get better managerial structures because there's more policy mechanisms to be able to aid in this. But second, we set a precedent for future regulatory changes. Previously, South Korea couldn't do this because of the lack of lobbying power and the strong oligarchical power that corporations have over the government. Within insofar that you pass this act, it allows a precedence for future politicians, future democratic elections, and future policy making to want to prioritize or to be able to prioritize working labor conditions, regardless of the chokehold that the corporations have over the South Korean economy. Thirdly, we're likely going to get a larger economic output in our side of the house because then you get a larger job market. That penetration of job market is way easier on our side of the house, which necessarily means you solve things like the birth rate, like decline of birth rate, or just like a lack of labor in the intelligence sector, but more on that later. Fourthly, you create more transparency in contracts because it's a larger stake. There's a larger stake when you're talking about legislatively. It's a lot easier for you to sue the corporations for all this abuse, for all these abuse, and for all these like mismanagement and like all this mismanagement of the employees and poor working conditions, which means they're likely going to be more transparent with their contract. They're likely going to be more compliant with the standards of way in which they should take care of their employees. Fifthly, within corporations now are likely to be more stringent in the things that they expect because insofar now these like they have a higher expectation over these employees. For example, when I'm giving you now 2 new hours of rest, I'm going to expect a larger productivity, larger output from your work, and we think this is something that's likely in our side of the house. The second argumentation then I want to posit to why this is going to lead to better investment in FDI, and it's going to be a direct clash with what opening opposition or consequentially a CEO is going to say. We think firstly, we're likely going to get better talent retention in our side of the house or more international immigration. For the very reason is because when you have stable working conditions, when you have the accountability mechanisms on a policy level to actually control the corporations and the way in which they operate, within the perception of South Korea as a businessman are likely going to improve, which means international investors, international talents and immigrants are likely going to want to come into things like MNC or even intensive labor, and that's something that's likely on our side of the house. But second, we're likely going to get better political stability as well because now people won't be making noise. Like people won't be making noise. It's already 6:20. Oh wait, yeah, it's already 6:20. People won't be making noise. It won't be the center stage of political discourse, which means you're likely going to get that Senate or parliamentary or federal court stability in outside the house. But thirdly, you're likely going to get better job market penetration intuitively because of things like annual salary increment, better bonuses, better living conditions, or just the option for you to be able to protect yourself legislatively from greedy and oligarchical corporations. Why is this possible? We think firstly, conglomerates can't just offshore the investments. So oppositions might going to say that this will probably scare off and shock off a lot of the corporations from trying to invest in South Korea. We think it's the opposite because a lot of times even conglomerates like South Korea, they cannot move their manufacturing sectors. They cannot move a lot of their property and real estate or a lot of their economy outside internationally because a lot of the deep-rooted establishment are already within South Korea. So it's likely going to have a sunk cost fallacy mechanism here for them to be able to retain investments within South Korea. And the second, employees. Oh, but why is it something that you ought to weigh over all the houses here? Because you decrease the labor intensive or the influx of labor within the intelligence sector. So proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. A reminder, anything beyond 7:15 will not go down on our sheets. Having said that, leader of op.
I just want to confirm if the recording is has started because it doesn't seem to have started on my end.
Or come, are you recording? I think we can just move on, honestly.
Okay. POIs will be taken through raise hand. The first response to launch against OG is just the idea of how they don't prove that the labor conditions in South Korea are that bad exactly. While it is correct to say that oftentimes the labor laws and the labor conditions within South Korea is more stringent than that of Western world, oftentimes it is already in the upward trend. That is to say that like laborers have been getting far better opportunities because of the progress that has been made. There's also to say that this is just because a lot of laborers are employed, and that's why it becomes far more easier to get things like bricks, specifically because there's a lot more people that is employed. That is to say that the direct condition of these labor conditions are decided by things like how many jobs are available in the market that allows employers and employees the flexibility to choose significantly better conditions for them, etc. But the second as well is just it's unclear why a lot of these laborers that they explain will be helped is able to take the capacity in suing, in demanding for more, when it's when they also explain that a lot of the economy of South Korea is heavily controlled by a lot of these chaebols that necessarily has the incentive to ensure that a more legislation is more strategic for them. So the first thing that we'll explain in argumentation coming from opening opposition is to just talk about what the Korean economy looks like, what the likely reaction is from these chaebols, and why ultimately this leads to the job market being far more difficult for the average South Korean as a whole. We'll first talk about chaebols and the way that they control the Korean economy. It is big firms that make up significant parts of the Korean economy. As a result, the state works around them. These are firms like Samsung and LG that hold significant parts of the GDP of South Korea, and that is why the state is far more likely to legislate favorable policies for them, precisely because a lot, like most of the time, their economy is heavily dependent on these few companies. The second, in Clause 1 of the Yellow Envelope Act, they will be implicated in most of the contracts that exist within South Korea. This is because the way that these chaebols operate right now is through employing contractors who carry out smaller scale operations for them, such as construction or manufacturing. The reason why they do this is because it's far more efficient than employing their own or than creating their own firm subsidiary groups that handle things like construction, because this means that they can focus more on their mainline businesses, such as like making the phones or the fridges that can talk to you. The act itself says that they are now the employers of these laborers as well, when they otherwise wouldn't be in status quo. So this means that the debate needs to have a discussion about how these chaebols will act in response, which I don't think opening government is able to do. Therefore, it's just quite unclear why exactly better outcomes will generate for the average South Korean when they don't explain how these new employers will then act towards them. The second is just the key of the debate is to ensure that these chaebols are on their best behavior in the way that they operate within South Korea, specifically because a lot of the motion within the debate is generated by the movements of these chaebol groups. Second, under them, is that the Yellow Envelope Act heavily increases their liabilities as a result of their dominance of the South Korean market. How do they respond? I think they're likely to respond in two ways. The first is they seek to gain more control of the operations to avoid the deviance of these contractors, because this means that if they cannot control the contractors who employ the laborers that do work for them, they will be held liable for these laborers as well, in opposition in status quo where the Yellow Envelope Act doesn't exist. It probably also means that they won't be held liable because that is a connection that is only made by the first clause of the Yellow Envelope Act. The second thing that they're likely to do, if you don't believe this case, is they're just likely to outsource work outside of South Korea. And I think in either path which they take, this is just far more worse for a lot of the laborers that they try to protect in government. The first thing they'll talk about then is the path to control. Why is it that this is the likely way that they approach the market? The first is they become far more liable for the way that contractors operate. This couples with the greater ability for unions to sue them and the lesser abilities for these companies to countersue in the instance that they do make bad business decisions, or they make business decisions that are inherently more favorable to them than the employees. What is the way that they likely going to operate and react then? I think it's far more likely that they cut off contractors and those on-site government. They cannot afford to have laborers be managed by those outside the conglomerate because of the difference in policies and because of the difference in the way that they apply labor laws. This also means that they cannot be too stringent with the contractors, and that's why there's less control for them, because the contractors themselves also benefit from the way that the Yellow Envelope Act is applied, specifically because they're still employees of these chaebol groups. That is why they also gain benefit from them having a greater decision making capability in the way that these chaebol groups make their decisions, in the way that they can sue and they can seek for higher action. This means that the second reason is just they decrease their responsibilities to ensure the stability of their company. Because the Yellow Envelope Act forces more responsibility for them, the natural reaction is to lessen that responsibility wherever they can, precisely because this means that there's more burden for them in the way that they operate their main businesses, which hampers their own productivity. This is bad because this means heavy losses for these industries. Firstly, for the contractors who lose the businesses because they get cut off by these chebbles. It is precisely because these chebbles would rather do this work on their own to ensure more control, to ensure that there's less bad conditions that they cannot control because of the way that they have the employee relationship with their contractors. This means that they just lose opportunities in creating businesses, in creating competition, which means that you give these chebbles far more control. So firstly, there's just less competition, and you give more power to chebble groups, specifically because you cut out contractors that would otherwise get these businesses and have the potential to grow in bigger businesses and gain more market share. Precisely because when this Yellow Envelope Act is put in place, there's just more incentive for these chebbles to do things like infrastructure and to do things like manufacturing themselves within their own conglomerate, because this means that they have greater control over the labor law policies and ensure that they don't violate a lot of these things, as opposed to the contractors, which I explained earlier. This also means the loss of livelihood for smaller businesses. But the second way that this is just bad for the average person is this also means the loss of job opportunity. So if OG is correct that the downturn of the South Korean economy means less capacity for these chebble groups, this also means that if they cut off all contractors, they cannot get all of the labor and absorb it within their own company, because this means that there's just far too many people that are displaced, and this means that their capacity cannot necessarily keep up with a lot of the people that they cut off, because oftentimes they're just like a few companies who cannot employ all of the market. But this in the second path where they leave, I think it's just where a lot of chebble groups become are now multinational and just likely move their operations outside. So this looks like moving all of manufacturing to China or Southeast Asia, where it is a lot cheaper, or where they can escape a lot of these Yellow Envelope Act laws, for instance. Whichever way you believe, the clear weighing that comes from opening opposition is that it is just unclear why the labor laws themselves are just really, really bad. At the very best, what we explain is that you can keep job opportunities, which is far better.
Thanks for that speech. A reminder again, if you say anything beyond 7:15, we will not note it down. Uh, DPM whenever.
Yeah, am I visible and audible?
Yup.
Give me a second to set my timer. Okay, good. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think it's very funny the way that OO actually tries to respond to our case, because it's very convenient in claiming certain things. I'll give you an example. We've proven you in PM speech that you get certain forms of deterrence because now companies are afraid of what the workers are able to do. And then LO comes up and they say that, but now companies will be afraid because they cannot counter sue. And therefore this is bad. Why? Because this is precisely the problem. It is clear in our framing that the chaebols have disproportionate power over the people. Because even if South Korea doesn't have a very large working force, the fact is a large part of the South Korean economy was contributed to by the chaebols. They have certain amount of sway over the government, because South Korea is inevitably, even though a developed state, it's still a very much corrupt one because of the way that it was built in the first place. Therefore, working conditions can be and is going to be very detrimental. It's going to be very bad, because these chaebols can do this. They have the capacity to be able to, for example, bribe the government to offset certain things. They have the capacity to, for example, say that, this is not what we are supposed to do. This is the wage that we are going to pay you, and these workers have nowhere else to turn to, because the entire economy is reliant on these huge corporations. If that is true, more accountability against these corporations more deterrence, because now that the people can sue the corporations, now that the people can riot and, for example, have certain protests that the chaebols cannot shut down, is good. Because right now, the chaebols will have to hold themselves accountable. These chaebols cannot cut people out. Because I don't know what LO's case is saying. They say, so right now the chaebols will start not employing people. But that's not how a corporation works, right? Because they still need these people to be able to call themselves a corporation in the first place. It is not soon that they can say, now we're just going to start, I don't know, employing migrated workers or immigrants and stuff like this, because there's no such thing as South Korea. But again, even if I were to buy that case, these laws still protect these people. It still encompasses the entire workforce, which at the end of the day just means one thing: there's more deterrence against the exploitation that is happening in South Korea per the framing. But secondarily, we say that we have more responsibility because when you hold these corporations accountable, LO's case is the natural reaction to responsibility is you're going to lessen this responsibility. Note how they say. They say that you're going to start reducing the size of the corporation. I want you to be very, 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 just think about it for a second. As a criminal, if my country now implements more CCTV, the way that I'm going to stop doing crime is not by just saying I shouldn't do crime, but to cut off my hands and legs, because this stops me from creating crime. It reduces my ability to commit crimes. Why is this the case? Why can't I just not commit crimes? And as a chaebol, there is no active incentive for you to actually start committing worker exploitation apart from you wanting to profit. But what this law does, it just holds you responsible, right? If you want to profit, do it in an ethical way. It is a simple response to the entirety of LO's responses. But let's be charitable. Even if less responsibility means offsetting certain workers, for example, laying off some workers to a certain extent to reduce the size of your corporation, this is their best case and this is our worst case. Why is this still good? Because you offset the amount of capacity for you to coerce people. You reduce the coercive power of a corporation in and of itself. When there is less size in Samsung, for example, it gives more capacity for other startups to actually survive within the country. You increase the amount of competition in that specific sector, therefore leading to better working conditions. Either way, the most vulnerable people in the economy is taken care of. Is there any rebuttals from CO or O before I move on?
So this assumes that your case, chaebols will comply. Why will chaebols comply if they have the negotiation power?
There is no reason for them not to comply, because the only point here is that they have profit incentive. Sure, maybe you have more profit, but this yellow whatever thing act, what it does is it proves to them that it's not worth the trade-off. Some profit does not equal that to you actually exploiting workers. It is not something that you want to do. But secondarily, and I think it's already clear in PM speech, the reason you comply is you want to prevent brain drain. You want to maintain the capacity for you to have actually good workers. You want to have actual good good workers within the economy to help power your company. If your working conditions are shit, these workers can just go elsewhere. They can go to China, they can go to Korea, they can go to Japan. There's all of these other places for these people to go to. The point of which your chaebols do not comply and working conditions are still incredibly bad as per the framing, there is absolutely no way that you're going to maintain the long-term sustainability of your profits or your company in the first place. There is an active incentive now for you to actually just be more ethical. We're not saying that you force these chaebols to reduce in size. We're not saying that we force these chaebols to somehow pay more. No, just be more ethical in the way that you do things. Don't exploit your workers. But here's the extension. Note here, it's not through the government that you're putting this pressure upon them. It's the government giving social capital to the people to advocate for change. You allow them to actually you actually ensure the sustainability of your worker union, for example. You ensure that they actually can go against these tables and say that we want better working conditions, we want maternity leaves, we want the basic human rights or basic rights of a worker to be protected. This means that even if the chaebols are still corrupted, even if the governments are still corrupted, it reduces the capacity of the chaebol to bribe the government and let them get off of their responsibilities. There's less scapegoating, there's more responsibility, and if the chaebol were to really want to get out of this, they would just have to appease the people, pay more, have more ethical practices, have more, holidays. It is so much harder to shut down the amount of people that you're exploiting rather than just shutting down the few government officials on the ops comparative. The impact here is simple. We get less brain drain because the chaebols they're usually centered in intelligence sectors, for example, tech like Samsung or engineering, for example, and all those things need the brain capacity. on our side, we protect this unique thing. Chaebols have an incentive to follow and comply. But second, you get better working conditions. I think that's just a given. This law allows people to advocate for things that they really truly believe in. It reduces the power that chaebols have to shut down. But lastly, I think the extension here is simple. We prove to you why governments, even if they are corrupt and even if they have no actual way to cooperate and with the chaebols and stuff like this, and even if it is really that bad, we give the people capital. We give the people the capacity to actually get the change that they want to. This protects them. This law is the only thing that's standing between the inherent corruption of a government, the inherent corruption of a chaebol, and the extreme, immense, improportionate power dynamic between the people and these corporations. We protect all of these people. Ops case cannot stand. The extension, I mean, the responses do not even make sense. For all these reasons, OG.
Thanks for that speech. TLR to conclude top half.
I'm just at the timer. Give me a second. Okay, I'll take a POI from closing if not opening. 3, 2, 1. A very important clarification I want to make is that the nature of opening government responses don't really target the main clash we create from opening opposition. It is not to say that we believe that corporations ought to do all of these extraneous factors and then they will be hurt. It is the fact that they change the internal structure in a way that hurts the South Korean economy more. How? We explain from Kyle the following things. Firstly, it's not that they stop employing, it's that they shift operations inside. It's doing things like not renewing the contracts of the existing contractors because these contractors are extraneous to the company and therefore have more viability to become a detriment if they're not under their control. In contrast, South Korean economies like Samsung are more likely to just do things like outsource these labor from outside of the nation in order to avoid the stringency of the law, as opening gov correctly points out, or they would just ensure that there are more people in Samsung that work specifically under this but it's owned by them. So therefore, even when these people have the ability to argue for the labor, Samsung can just threaten them to just be like, well, your job is the one I currently hold. So why would it be the case that this job you have to leave this job if it's true that I'm the one giving you all of the subsistence that you currently have. Opening government would suggest that this is bad and this is exactly the problem. But the reason why it doesn't work on opening gov is because they don't have an alternative. It's not as if the state is the one controlling these trebles, it's the other way around. So obviously the state is the one on the bargaining end of the table and they have to be the ones adjusting to the demands of these trebles because otherwise it's them who suffers as a result. So that's the clarification. I first want to explain why the OG case on argument 1 does not have an impact. The first is because, as I explained, the argument only works if the state can work independent of the trebles. Why is this not the case? Firstly, because trebles are the fulcrum of the South Korean economy. In status quo, they hold control over the state through things like the economy, through things like labor, and through things like their instances of getting more soft power because they are a very what do you call this, like attractive economy, for instance, which is why the state loses more if the state has unreasonable demands, which is why more people are hurt as a result. I think it was quite clear from Kyle. Why would Chebos comply on government as was the clear question we posited from the POI? Because firstly, if they can make the money anyway, this is quite ignorant of how actually the South Korean economy is structured. There are two reasons why they cannot just like be ethical workers, as sad as it is. The first is because South Korea is an export-oriented manufacturing company, and the nature of this means that they need cheap manpower that they can employ from within the country and then make sure that they can scale up these operations to remain competitive in an export-oriented manner, which is why there are so many phones like Samsung being sold, so many other corporations that Korea owns, what have you. But the second is that if the negotiation power is one these Chebos control, the state is on the losing end for three reasons. Firstly, it's because at the point in time when these same corporations outsource their labor and there's less of this money funneling towards the same individuals who you aim to protect, then obviously it means that there are less people who get jobs, people get less opportunities, and therefore have less purchasing power to do things like create their goods. But secondly, if it's true that South Korea is moving outside, right, then it's just more likely that these same people who benefit from that industry don't often just like give back this money back to the South Korean government because the South Korean government doesn't have enough regulatory power in order to overturn these chaebols. And even if they had, it's not like they have much of a choice because this choice is still dependent on how well they can function without the particular company at hand. But thirdly, it's just the fact that the average South Korean citizen, when they are faced with no opportunities because blue collared work is now barred off, white collared work is hard to achieve because it's hyper competitive as a market, you just create more unemployed people who otherwise would have gotten employed on our side of the debate. So if it's just a question of where the labor is, our labor is still fine, and the only reason it is still fine is because you are not rage baiting these chaebols into creating these reactions that would have otherwise been caused in massive support of the Yellow Envelope Act. Before I explain why the labor we have is sufficient and why it's perfectly working, I'll take the POI.
Is it expensive for Samsung to move their headquarters and manufacturing to, for example, China or Malaysia?
Maybe, but the point is not that. It's not that they're moving their industry outside. It's the fact that they hire people from outside instead of hiring people from inside, which is why South Koreans get less jobs overall, because they're now competing with people from outside of South Korea, like the same Malaysians, same Japanese, same Filipinos, what have you. Why is labor better on our side? The first is because there's just inherently less competitive natures to the other jobs that South Koreans would have otherwise gotten. And this is because there is still amenability between the chaebols and the government. Even though there is little like negotiating power on behalf of this government, the fact that the current labor market is still okay and some amount of people are getting employed means that it's still net utility. Maybe this is just mitigation, but it is enough mitigation to the first argument in as much as they don't get to unlock the majority of their benefits insofar as they don't prove why the state has the ability to act independently and has the ability to control the circumstances and outcomes post that. But second, I'm just gonna run like a very basic argument. It's not clear in this argument to what degree the same companies have so much control over every part of the supply chain and manufacturing chain. So if we're unjustly punishing these groups of people for the simple reason that it's hard to manage, right? And this is the worst case scenario of opposition, then it's quite unclear why we should punish the largest corporation as opposed to the contractors who were doing those bad practices in the first place. And if opening government's impact is what that can be unlocked by targeting the biggest corporation, then obviously our impacts fly more because we explain why these people are just not the same individuals you can arbitrarily like push around. So on our side, labor is better because we keep the same amount of employed people versus opening gov and closing gov where there are less of them because they have to compete with a larger group of individuals. Secondly, it's also the fact that we just proved that on either side of the debate, it's unclear to what degree these chaebols have that much control over the supply chains. At the very least, we can be fair with the judicious processes and explain that we don't need to punish the most, like, I guess, general processes of it, but instead make sure that the same people who are making these bad practices are the ones that get cut and not the ones like instigate and not instigate them any further. Lastly, it's just the fact that on our side of the debate, labor laws are working fine for three structural reasons. Number one, it's the fact that there is no further instigation that would allow these corporations to move unjustly. If obviously these people have a legitimate reason to move as a result of this being bad for their company, more people are likely to agree with it as a result of it happening. But on our side, because they haven't had that instigation, they can't make that move because it would make them unpopular. Secondly, it's just the fact that we don't move the competitive nature of this upwards. The simple matter is that we would rather much higher internally rather than externally and compete against them. But thirdly, we explain why this is just more principally just because people are more judged based on the nature of the result as opposed to blaming the entire system altogether.
Thanks for that speech. That concludes top half. Member of Gov to start back half.
Can I just confirm that I'm audible and visible?
Yep.
Thank you. I'll start on my first word. This entire debate so far has been a question of what's best for workers on a small level, what's best for companies on a small level without looking at the bigger picture, without looking at economies as a whole and rights of workers as a whole and the more principled side of this debate. What I hope to do in my speech is to do a few things. First, I want to extend on the rights of workers. Secondly, I want to give a more principled view to this debate and extend on opening government's case. And thirdly, I want to respond and take down everything that we've got from opening opposition so far. That's what I'm going to start with. Firstly, they tell us that employers become more liable unreliable, and that's going to cause a bunch of problems. But firstly, at face value, we respond to that telling you that this is good. They tell us that lack of competition is going to occur, but we think that that in reality comes from overpowered chaebols, not unions. It comes from these massive conglomerates taking down small businesses and any other kind of competition. We think that unions having more power and smaller businesses having that more power and workers having that greater power is going to lead to greater competitions, not only in terms of firms vying for productivity, but also firms vying for worker conditions, which is infinitely better for workers and exclusive to our side because we create that competition with this act. They tell us about how regulation is the scourge of competition, but we don't think that regulation has ever killed competition. Observe Germany, Scandinavia, where those economies are highly productive, yet still have high worker rights. They tell us companies are going to move and companies are going to outsource, but we tell you that both the logistical and the reputational costs are far too much. Outsourcing is literally the status quo. The law doesn't create outsourcing, it stops the parent companies from being liable for it. And if they can't afford that liability, then the only other options for these companies are either outsourcing or making working conditions better. I've just shown to you why outsourcing can't work because of the fact that it's too expensive or because of the fact that these are big household names. Therefore, the only option for these companies is now to make working conditions better for their labor force. And again, that competition is created in terms of who has the most productive, best working force. Next response, they tell us about how firms are going to bring in outside workers from other countries. They can't do this forever. We don't think this is empirically true. We think that migrants still need protection. And even if they are right and firms do want cheaper pools of labor all the time, that is exactly why we need acts like the yellow envelope to protect these migrants. They tell us that being harsh on companies will create problems. However, we are just getting them to be ethical. And again, regulation has never been the enemy of competition and innovation. We need that responsibility. And if they are so pressed about firms making a fuss, then the firms should just ensure that there are better conditions for the workers that we will get them to do through this act. They ask us the question multiple times about how labor is better on our side, and they give us a bunch of reasons that I've just responded to. But let me quickly tell you why labor is better on our side based on what we've already told you in opening and what we're going to tell you in closing. We've already told you about worker benefits. We've told you about how there's going to be contract transparency, there's going to be job markets being larger. But now I'm going to extend this to tell you about how workers are going to be better off on our side by talking about liability, exemptions for no exemptions for subcontractors, and unions being protected. So 3 main reasons. Firstly, on power correction. Economically, we tell you that we get more bargaining power for workers on our side of the house because the power shifts towards them. And politically, firms have lobbyists, which increase the political representation in government because of the fact that there's more pressure on parties to deal with larger unions. Comparatively, again, unions are larger and more powerful, so there is more power in politics and in larger areas. Secondly, we tell you it corrects that work-heavy culture that is so detrimental in South Korea. Firms are going to start to move away from excessive workload, etc., even if workers are not a part of a union, since they're scared of getting sued, because unions start to feel more empowered through this act, and by virtue of that, people start to feel more empowered and they start to question the norm of a work-heavy culture. This is again improving their day-to-day lives as workers. Thirdly, it improves the situation for minorities especially. For example, you've got women, you've got ethnic communities, you've got religious minorities. These people are more willing to go on strike to protect themselves, and also tend to be the people who are marginalized by the economic system and who are more marginalized by these big conglomerates. These are your Uber drivers, the people who are completely screwed over on side opposition, and they're not doing anything for them, when in reality we are. We're giving them this act, we're giving them these protections, we're giving them this power. Now that we're done with the 3 practical benefits to extend everything that we've got from opening government that are unique to our side, to our team, what we want to give you is 2 principal layers to give like a bigger aspect or like a bigger perspective on this debate. The first thing we want to tell you is that workers use this as self-defense, because opening government has already proved to you how these corporations are evil, how these corporations do not want what is best for the workers, they want what is best for themselves. But we think that if you look at that on a larger scale, you start to see that by virtue of the corporations having more power than the workers and using that to essentially screw them over, the workers need a form of self-defense. And that is what this Yellow Envelope Act does. It provides them with that level of political power, with that level of with that level of political power to fight back against those corporations who are so harmful to them. I'll take a POI if you had one. Someone unmuted.
The last I checked, South Korea didn't gaff about minorities, but the second I checked is that many of the corporations of Korea are already very big, so it's not clear why outsourcing will be that expensive.
It's not a question of expensive, because in some cases, yes, it will be too expensive. But in the case where they do have the money to do it, there is still the question of the fact that they are so big that they are a massive household name. They have massive like reputational costs, and there's just a question of all of a sudden, all the news stories in South Korea being that Samsung has fired all of their South Korean workers and is bringing in all these workers from Malaysia. That is not what they want to do with their reputation, especially in a market as sensitive in that as that. And in terms of South Korea not gaffing about like minorities, of course they won't. But this is going to give them even less reason to do so because of the protections that are greater on our side. So moving on, they get to use this to defend themselves against those corporations. So that is the most important principal reason as to why we should support this act. But secondly, we're going to give you a principle on democracy to essentially win this debate. We think that we say that this law has been passed into legislature and will be implemented. Korea has a democratic system with a parliament of representatives, and it has therefore has to represent the will of the people. Opposing this law literally means that you oppose the democratic will of the people. That is, you oppose the results of the democratic process. You violate the principle of democracy. And why is representing the people's will important? Because of the fact that you have given you have the people giving you your votes, you have the people putting their power in you, and it is your duty therefore as a state to ensure that you fulfill their role. Note that this is especially important in this case because the law represents the interests of the workers who are currently underrepresented. The corporate lobby is more represented, so it's more democratic on our side of the house, especially for those vulnerable actors, i.e. those workers, especially those minorities. And at the point at which you oppose a law that has been democratically passed, you violate this principle. So why do we win this debate on side proposition and especially on closing government? We win this debate because we give you unique impacts on the general principal aspect of this debate. We give you unique impacts about why workers have special benefits, and we take down everything you get in opening opposition. That is why we are so proud to propose vote CG. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech, member of OP.
Just a minute. I'll be stopped.
Member of OP. Member of OP.
I'll be starting. Hi, I'm Swastika Mondal.
Just a second, she'll be joining from her device.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
I'm Swastika Mondal. Preferred pronounce she or her, and I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one, and go. Understand only rebuttal that the entire govs to the fact of these big companies or like any company outsourcing shifting their operations is that, oh, it's a matter of reputation, it's a matter of huge amounts of money, which is why they won't do. I'll tell it in through our speech why this is not the case and why this will actively harm South Korea. Understand that as it has been already been established, South Korea's entire economy depends on exports. They are like dependent on exporting these materials to outside countries. They have no other sources of developing their economy, which means that they don't have inherent resources like minerals or agriculture or any other things on which they can sustain their job market, on which they can provide jobs or like have any kind of development in their economy, which means that once this export industry in itself is harmed, it's not only the companies that get harmed but the people living in the country in itself who faces this damage through like trickle down effect. Now why do I say this? Understand that it's how these big conglomerates or these big chaebols operate like Samsung or Hyundai is that they have a multiple operation through like tier 2 companies, tier 3 companies within the country which manufactures these small products and then give them and ultimately make this big products and then like export it, which means that like South Korean itself has is as an edge over the global market or is trusted is because of its supply chain reliability, because of the way it produces the smaller products through these thousands and dozens of like tier 2 tier 3 industries within in itself and then providing in export in itself, which means that the moment at which you do this and a like any kind of strike or any kind of like happening in a single tier 2 company escalates up to the big companies, the parent companies in itself, which means that a single tier 2 company strike can escalate up to Samsung, like electronics in itself. There's an increase in systemic risk in global supply chains, which means that understand that at the point that a tier 2 supply chain industry strikes, the parent Hyundai company gets sued and attacked because the narrative is that they control the working conditions, which means that any strike happening in these smaller industries, the parent company's operations are like sued and happening. Now understand that why is like this parent company is getting sued is extremely bad. Understand that they have to like go about and spend extreme amounts of financial resources for these lawsuits to like spend more on their legal defenses, go on and double down on their litigations and all, and also have to like go and spend money to go and survive these kinds of legal suits. Second of all, it has a huge impact on their reputation, which means at the moment that this big parent companies keeps on getting lawsuits from these strikes in even like tier 2 industries, or even understand now the fact is it's not only through these supply chains that they're getting risks. Each kind of these big companies has now multiple like sectors through which they faces lawsuits, which means that if any like their logistics sector gets any kind of strike, the supply chain industry gets any strike, all the lawsuits that will be filed will be handled by these big conglomerates, which means that understand the reputational and monetary damage that these big conglomerates or big companies in itself that drive the economy of South Korea are facing are extremely huge. So then what is the impact? Understand that at the moment that your industry in itself, the parent company gets attacked and gets like has to face all these legal suits and everything, your operations in itself are halted, which means that if some Samsung faces cascading continuous strikes from suppliers, it means there's a loss of like efficiency of semiconductor chips, which means that if Hyundai stops outsourcing parts, Korea's car export stops in itself, which means that the economic market within South Korea becomes extremely like volatile and untrustworthy, which means that global buyers in itself stop like trusting the market of South Korea in itself, and they move to other viable and options like Japan or any kind of like export companies which provide much more reliable things. Second of all, understand that the company in itself, on the moment that they see these countries extremely like unreliable in terms of this, they move operations to neighboring countries, which means that the headquarters in itself start withdrawing operations from South Korea in itself, which means that nobody wants to invest in your country. There's no FDI in itself, which means that domestic industries start accelerating capital foreign expansion in other countries, which means that the domestic development in your own country completely halts, which means that at the moment that this big conglomerates see that any kind of like strikes, any kind of lawsuits that are facing left and right from any kind of smaller tier 2 tier 3 industries are making them cause financial damages, and they're on headlines every day for like this kind of news. The point is that they see that I can easily move on to neighboring countries like Vietnam or India or Mexico, where there are much more relaxed labor laws, where they don't have to face any kind of lawsuits. The profit margin that they get exponentially increases in their side, which means that now they can invest more in RTI stuff like that and don't have to care for like battling up their like legal defenses or stuff like that. Understand at the moment at which they can see that their business has much more options there, they they will outsource. Second of all, understand that even like how does like FDI or like any kind of investment in a country happens when they see that this kind of global market has an edge over it, where they see that there is any kind of like stability or stuff like that. At the moment like South Korea's job stability or like market stability falls, I don't see any kind of foreign industry investing for any kind of new expansion, even if you don't buy like like already established countries. Understand that there's no like future expansion or no future investments of the country, which means that South Korea's economic market gets extremely stagnated. There's no creation of new jobs. Third of all, understand that all these big MNCs or any kind of industries like the semiconductor, which is extremely like every day needs to revolutionize, every day needs to change structures or like outsource and expand to survive the competition of the markets, which means that understand that export markets of South Korea, which depend on semiconductors or automobiles or stuff like that, they need continuous restructuring, continuous automation, and continuous stuff like that. But now understand under this bill, any kind of new automation, any kind of IT outsourcing or any kind of like AI or any kind of job layoff they do, they know that what they're going to face is constant lawsuits from their employees for doing any kind of restructuring, which means that inefficiency in these companies within South Korea itself is greatly hampered. At the point of which this happens and companies realize that they have no future regrowth, future restructuring, or any kind of efficiency in their headquarters in like South Korea or industries in South Korea itself, they don't want to invest in these industries and want to go to a country where they can do all this without having any kind of risk or without having any kind of fear of lawsuits faced left and right. Which means that understand that these industries which heavily depend on automation, on AI, on restructuring every day and all managerial kind of thing, they have no future prospects within South Korea in itself. Which means that this is not only like temporarily employees don't get jobs or employees don't, it reconstruct further to the entire economy of South Korea in itself crashing down and having a trickle down effect.
Thanks for that speech, GovWhip, to conclude the case on GovBench.
Sure, just give me a second to gather my notes. All right, am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. 3 things in this speech panel. First of all, on working conditions in South Korea. Secondly, on how employers and these contractors act. And thirdly, on the power of unions. So firstly, what are working conditions in South Korea actually like? What we got from opening government was that there's a bad economy. There's a lot of unemployment in South Korea, meaning that there's less inter-firm labor market competition. And at the point where you do have that, you have this sort of dearth of labor market demand, you can offer bad working conditions to people because there is no sort of pressure to provide good ones. They have to sort of take what they have and people will, they don't really have bargaining power. We agree with this analysis. However, we think it's sort of assertive and short-term thinking. Firstly, they sort of just told you that there's a bad economy. I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. We'd have to Google that to know. But secondly, this only occurs in the short term. Why then do we believe on closing government that it is actually going to be bad? Firstly, because South Korea tends to have a very hierarchical culture, which permeates into its work culture. At the point where you have this, you don't really have the kind of culture where you can question your superior, where you can question your manager, where you can say, hey, actually, you're kind of treating me very badly. You need a union to advocate on your behalf. Secondly, you have the proximity to countries like Japan and like China with very bad working cultures. This sort of like very overworked, like 12-hour days means that by virtue of this proximity, you have worse conditions in South Korea simply because of international competition. Because you are competing for the same sort of labor market share, you have to, for the same sort of exports geographically speaking. Therefore, you have to sort of like offer cheaper goods, and you do that by offering worse working conditions. Now, thirdly, on the historical context of being tied to the USA. Note that South Korea was on the US side during the Korean War, and the US was very involved in setting up the political system in South Korea. Note that this was mid-Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings. Note that the US tends to be very anti-union, and at the point where you have this, the sort of system of the political and economic system that was created in South Korea tended to be quite anti-union, quite sort of anti-working conditions. Therefore, what we tell you is the reality is that you do have bad working conditions in South Korea. You do have bad sort of union power, and at the point where this law is being introduced, very evidently there is enough will to improve the political the sort of working conditions. You do evidently have enough people believing that the working conditions are bad, which is another reason why we tell you you do have bad working conditions. Therefore, what can you take from this? Firstly, that improvements in union power are likely to be good, and secondly, that the power of unions is likely going to increase simply because you already have bad working conditions, which we've explained to you. So any sort of improvement in union power, that they are able to advocate for people, that they are able to get better working conditions, is going to lead to quite a significant increase in sort of the quality of life for workers, meaning that anything we say should be weighed highly. Now, secondly, in this idea of how employers are likely to act, we sort of get 3 things across the bench. So firstly, opening opposition tells you that you are going to cut off subcontractors. but we tell you this is good, right? Because now you are not paying a middleman. You have more money for wages. So even if the majority of that like new extra money goes to shareholder, you can still probably increase some wages for your workers. Now, on this idea that these subcontractors lose jobs and opportunities, but we tell you there is still demand for labor simply because you still need people to produce goods. You're not suddenly going to be able to automate like everything in your process. What this actually looks like is that workers, so for example, Uber drivers now work directly with Uber instead of for some sort of subcontractor which like contracts with Uber. Business owners, not workers, are the ones who lose out. This now outweighs anything the opposition tries to push to us on vulnerability simply because the working conditions of workers matter so much more. They are the ones who are historically marginalized. They are the ones who have less money, less sort of standard of living. And secondly, on scale, there are on net less workers than there are business owners. Now, finally, on this idea of like you have less of a monopoly, but we tell you this is untrue simply because the provision of services to consumers doesn't change at the point where you cut off subcontractors, right? And monopoly only matters to us at the point where it leads to a worse product. At the point where the provision of services is the same, you don't actually change anything with monopoly, but we can see that the opposition bench sort of dropped this anyway. Now, secondly, on this idea of firing people and doing outsourcing, we tell you this is simply untrue. This was sort of repeated down the opposition bench, and they didn't really interact with what we said. We said, first of all, there are setup costs. Secondly, it's not always applicable for a lot of jobs. You do want people being on site, being in your country. And thirdly, note that if you look at the info site, it actually counts within a labor dispute. If you look at the info side, you now have labor disputes, including things like outsourcing. That means that people can sue, people can strike, and you are going to have significant opposition to this outsourcing, which means that you're likely not actually going to be able to do it. Now, thirdly, on this idea that you're simply going to like move and just leave the country entirely, we tell you this is untrue. The first thing we said was reputation, but even if we like take them at their best and we accept that, we tell you first of all you have a sunk cost fallacy. You've already this is like within the minds of like shareholders and CEOs. They decide, oh well, we've already got this, to like turn away from this would be terrible. Secondly, you have the sort of costs of moving. You have to pay redundancy to everyone in the country. You have the legal costs of ending HR agreements, ending rental agreements. Thirdly, you're still making money. So you're only actually going to move if this like somehow threatens the entire profitability of your country. And fourthly, you have oftentimes firms have non-profit incentives to hold on to market share so they have a presence in that country. So then what is actually going to happen? Yes, you are going to drop subcontractors and the intermediaries, i.e. the people at the top, will be out of work. But you're going to hire workers still because you need labor to produce things, and outsourcing will not occur. I'll now take a POI.
So at best, Gov explains that the policy can be good in a vacuum and that labor rights are good, but not that it achieves that specific effect in the specific context of the South Korean economy, which we explained.
Yeah, that's great because I'm right getting onto that. Now, finally, the thing is, can these unions actually change working conditions? We tell you several things. Now, what we get from opposition is that there's less jobs and so on because there's not enough money. We tell you, first of all, this is empirically untrue. If you look at any country that instituted or increased the minimum wage, they didn't get mass unemployment after. They just got this is a self-fixing policy. You have at the point where people have more spending power because they have better working conditions or higher wages because of their unions, there's more money in the economy, just there's more consumption, so you get greater derived demand for labor. So that's not actually true. Now, secondly, gives us this idea that the government doesn't have enough power or money to hold these firms accountable, but they very empirically do. Now, thirdly, this idea that firms are unable to improve working conditions that we get from and kind of from that POI. We tell you that the ratio average CEO pay to average worker pay has grown from 30 to 1 in 1970 to 300 to 1. This is such a cop-out. This is a very clearly self-fixing policy. You are able to do this. And at the point where CEO basically gives us this entire case on why this is such a big risk to firms, basically means that actually, yeah, you are going to have a significant amount of bargaining power over these over these firms. People are going to have better working conditions. People's lives improve.
Thanks for that speech. Op Whip to conclude the debate.
Right. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Hello, I'm Adway. Opweb, prefer pronounce he, him. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I'm going to quickly summarize CO case and then I'm going to go house by house comparison with all the other three houses. What does CO give you? Our extension is simple. Creating harmful environments for business ends up impacting the workers that we want to affect so badly within this debate, right? Firstly, we give extension to OO about how supply chains and labor forces are affected due to this law. We give explicit mechanism as to how conglomerate interests being hurt are going to lead to some of the most business harming environments since the rapid expansion they undertook for economic growth. We give you explicit framing as to why they need those business friendly environments. South Korea is a country that has no resources that it can export. Only thing it can do is export manufactured goods. The point at which you make manufacturing goods a very, very difficult thing to do. I don't see any reason why creating a business harmful environment leads to any sort of progress at all. But beyond that, we give you explicit impact framing on how it ends up affecting South Korea at the macro level, something that CG wanted to talk about, right? It's not 1 minute. Insofar as there is massive disincentive for job creation within South Korea, workers within the country are cooked anyways because of two reasons. Firstly, we tell you why there is going to be a lack of jobs within the market itself. This is due to two things. Firstly, contractors not having enough contracts to actually go ahead and hire workers, but also secondly, companies having the incentive to go ahead and outsource work, maybe shift operations outside. I mean, not completely. Maybe like this is something that comes up with on OG side, on government side, that they can't shift the entire thing. Well, they can shift like a majority of the business. They'll shift as much as they can just to minimize the cost that they're going to have to pay for entertaining labor laws. But apart from like having those lack of jobs within the market itself, the second impact is very clear that there is lower wages for workers as supply of labor now far outpaces demand. This is a problem specifically for South Korea because the labor market is very, very saturated. The point at which now it becomes more saturated. Now companies don't want to hire people. Now people are getting hired for much less wages, much more harmful conditions than anything that they've been ever subject to in the recent past, which means that any impact that OG and CG want to claim, they need to prove that how even with all this massive regulation that's happening, they create enough jobs in the market to go ahead and have competitive wages for people, competitive working environments for people. Right. But also, secondly, we talk about how FDI is heavily disincentivized due to two mechanisms that are built within the yellow envelope. Right. Firstly, there's striking without ramifications. The point at which workers can go ahead and strike and cannot get countersued for financial damages. I think there is much more likelihood that they're going to strike more often. Unions are going to be much more bolder in terms of how frequently they're conducting those strikes. The point at which the company can't sue these people for undue claim or undeserved claims. I don't see any reason why uh, incentives for companies to go ahead and hire more workers, which are going to lead to more strikes, ever exist. But secondly, there is lack of structural changes to companies due to the threat of lawsuits. This is completely unique. This is something that you get completely uniquely on CO. I don't think any of the other three houses talk upon this. This is the second part of the act that says that any sort of structural change within the company is open to labor lawsuits, which means the point at which you want to restructure the company, you probably want to lay off people, you want to merge with some other company, you want to automate some of the process, which leads to loss of jobs. You are very, very susceptible to labor lawsuits, very, very susceptible to massive financial costs and legal costs that are going to accrue over time because these unions are so massive and because there is no ramification for them going ahead and conducting those labor lawsuits at your company. So the impact that you get on CO is very simple. Firstly, there is a very, very massive lack of jobs within the market itself. There are lower wages for workers because now the supply of labor is too much, but also because FDI is heavily disincentivized, point at which companies within the chaebols within South Korea are going to outsource, going to shift to other countries, and FDI is heavily disincentivized. No other companies ever going to come into South Korea. I don't see any reason why job creation actually happens. How does this engage with the other three houses? What do you get on government, right? What does OG say? They say conglomerates care about profits and thus cut corners. For example, compensation when getting fired, they lobby governments, etc. The problem is governments still care about the vote banks that vote them into power. They want the support of the unions. The point at which they're seen as actively harming workers too much, they'll always end up losing the popular vote. The fact that this act was ever discussed in parliament is proof of this. They say unions are likely to get censored on op side. This is not really true. They just claim this as an assertion, but it's never really proved, right? Unions also care about their own optics. There are multiple unions and they try to cater to all workers and try to poach each other's workers. There is competition among the unions. They're considered as protectors of workers' right. The point at which they settle for money instead of bringing about change in the system, their members are likely to abandon them, which they can't afford. But anyways, why does this matter? As long as unions sue chaebol, they'll get paid off eventually anyways. They never give any comparative analysis on why on their side lawsuits are more likely to be successful anyways, apart from just creating financial and legal costs for the chaebol itself, right? But also they talk about how better FDI because of talent retention, right? Companies don't just want talent, they want a business friendly market. There is talent elsewhere. Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia have been making massive steps in making the labor within their economies more attractive. The point at which there is a lot of talented labor outside South Korea, but with more relaxed labor laws, I think it's much more likely that those companies will ever go in. So any impact that OG wants to claim about FDI doesn't ever unlock. We give you explicit reasons why FDI is disincentivized instead. What does CG tell you, right? They talk about the bigger picture. They say the regulation has not hurt competition in Germany, Scandinavia, etc. That's because companies still have the ability to countersue unions, bringing up undeserved lawsuits, ensuring that as long as regulations are followed, they don't have to give in to undue worker demands at any point. Right? Then they go on to talk about like the principle of what this act stands for. They talk about two things. Firstly, they talk about workers using it to defend themselves. Problem is, workers can use it to defend themselves. They might feel that they're using it to defend themselves. The point at which most jobs are going to get cut off from the economy. The economy is going to go into a downturn. Most companies are going to shift outside South Korea. I don't see how workers have any better conditions. I think it's principally wrong to just finish off jobs for these workers who are already living in very bad conditions. Just because you feel that this can get better impact. The problem is, as long as alternatives for manufacturing exist outside South Korea, none of the impacts that government side can accrue to a substantial degree as the degree that O and CO have proved. But also they talk about the principle of democracy, right? The problem is that democracy needs an informed decision. The point at which these workers and these people are fed up with these chaebols, they can go ahead and vote for things that are very, very regulation heavy, but will never actually, beyond time, but they never actually lead to positive impacts at all on their side of the world, right? They try to respond to O by saying that now businesses don't have to pay a middleman and thus better conditions. The issue is that if that were true, businesses would never hire contractors in the first place. The reason they hire contractors is because they make business easier to conduct. The point at which you force them to take up extra work, there is no reason to believe that business at any point is becoming easier, and thus they're more likely to invest.
Thanks for that speech and everybody for that debate. Teams can cross the floor over and leave the room. But you need to go back to the main Zoom call. We'll call you back in around 15 minutes with the OA. Thanks so much. 30 more seconds. I want to start in a bit. Okay, so we reached a consensus decision. We saw this as a top half debate, with the first going to opening opposition, the second going to opening government, the third going to closing government, and an unfortunate fourth going to closing opposition. Opening opposition takes a first, opening government takes a second, closing government takes a third, and closing opposition takes an unfortunate fourth. I can do feedback later. You can approach me or anybody from the panel also, but I'll try to keep this way as concise as possible. Top half first. So the way we saw the top half interaction is that opening government had lots of explanations for why chaebols or the economy in South Korea is currently incredibly bad, or in an incredibly bad position, specifically vis-a-vis the rights that they provide to labor, and this is the reason why this specific policy is required. So I think the way OG tries to frame the argument is that labor currently does not have enough rights, and the fact that this policy was passed is the reason for why unions become far more powerful, because corporations cannot bypass them very easily. Plus the fact that they don't have to spend as much money on lawsuits is the reason for why unions likely will become more powerful as a consequence, which is the reason for why labor rights will be protected much better than on ops world, where labor protections for unions don't exist, or for individual individual labor does not exist. And that's the reason why OG tries to explain, or that's the pathway that OG takes to explain that they uniquely get more labor rights than op teams can ever do. What's the problem? The problem that we felt though with this material was, and generally the OG case was, that it wasn't very clear whether the policy itself is the way to achieve the end impact that OG was trying to achieve. So OG explains that the specific implications of this bill or of this policy might be like change in managerial positions, or more importantly the incentives of managers at the top of these organizations changing, or the fact that there's more impetus for future regulations for governments because they are not scared of the power of that the chaebols or these big companies have in South Korea, which is the reason why you can control monopolistic behavior later in the future. The problem is, as opening opposition points out, is that if it's the case that these companies are powerful, then they're likely to remain powerful on either side of the debate. So it's not like that the existence of the bill will be strong enough to counteract how powerful these chaebols are if it's the case that they are deeply entrenched into the South Korean economy. And this is the first thing that opening opposition points out. So what is not clear already, as a consequence of that response, is whether this policy will be effective in creating regulatory checks against companies as large as the chaebols, who are like such as Hyundai and Samsung, who are actively integrated into the South Korean economy to the point where the South Korean economy heavily depends upon the existence of those companies. I think what opening opposition then does, and this is where we felt that OO is ahead from OG, is that they explain the specific way in which the company or these companies will respond to this policy. Or the material that O has is to say that the business model that the chaebols have currently is to outsource the management of their labor to external contractors, because it's just easy for them that way currently, considering that there are no liabilities. But what this policy would do is that this would increase the liability, considering that like when the contractors have to be charged for something, then the liability will also fall on the parent company. And that is the reason why like the chaebols will want centralization of control, and the contractors would have to go away, or at least they would throw away the contractors, because that is the only way in which they can ensure that company policy aligns with what they want, as opposed to contractors doing what they want. Like we would obviously point out, we discussed this as well, is that it is still not evidently clear from opening opposition fully whether contractors always act in interests which are against what the parent company does. Like it needed to be clear whether there is a significant diversion of interest to the point where this policy will actually end up affecting the way contractors are hired or not. But it is analysis still more than opening government in the debate to explain how companies will respond to this policy. So what O does as a consequence of that is to explain that because you have more centralization of control, presumably companies will become far more worse, because all of the harms that OG was pushing on OO about companies being harmful will be exacerbated further once there is more centralization of control. But secondly, this would also drive up labor costs, which is the other claim that opening opposition has for how this policy would work, which is the reason that O explains for why companies do not have enough available money to provide in the form of wages to people. And then that's the reason why the policy itself is unsustainable, because the costs will increase over time and companies cannot sustain it. What are OG's responses to this case? The first thing that OG responds to is by suggesting that layoffs is not an option for companies, because it is bad for their optics, specifically in a country like South Korea, because there might be scrutiny on them, there might be public backlash on them if they do not comply with this policy. And secondly, I think OG points out that the very fact that it's something legal is the reason for why companies are forced to comply with it. So and that's like a forceful measure is more important to ensure that companies comply with the policy, as opposed to the things that opening opposition is suggesting. While we think this is true, the problem is OO, uh, like it's not super clear whether these policies are strong enough against the power that the chaebols have. But more importantly, the second claim from O about capacity reducing over time is an explanation that directly beats OG, because what it explains is that even in the ambit of the legal frameworks that OG is talking about, O's case might still operate by suggesting that if chaebols are bad, then they will become worse, because the amount of money that they would have would reduce further. So the justification to not give money to the labor would also increase over time, considering that they lose money, and hence all of OG's harms might exacerbate further, because the claim that O makes is not an incentive claim. Like the second claim is not an incentive claim, but rather a capacity claim, which is the reason why the labor market or individual labor that OG wanted to benefit would possibly not get benefited or get harmed much more in OG's case, as per O, considering that the labor cost would drive up over time and companies would not have enough money for it, so they will try to adjust. I would flag that the claim from O that these countries like these companies might leave and go to other countries and there might be capital flight does not fly in the debate. Opening government's response is correct in pointing out that the threshold of leaving is quite high. There is already material at Prime Minister actually to trade this off by saying that shifting all your manufacturing supplies to another country already has massive, significant costs for you as a company, which you would not want to do. So it's not very clear whether leaving is an option. The other option I think that O suggests as an alternative is that you can hire immigrant workers, which again is asserted in the debate. Like it's not very clear whether you will be able to effectively replace all the South Koreans that you have currently employed with all a significant chunk of immigrants. And I think OG somewhat points it out as well by suggesting that it might be somewhat unpopular. Like I do think both of those things are equally as assertive in the debate. Like OG suggesting that it might be unpopular, and O suggesting that immigrant workers don't fall under the ambit of labor laws the way like an average South Korean would. And hence I think that interaction, while both teams on top half make that interaction, it's not super conclusive as to who is ahead within that interaction because it's equally assertive from both teams. And hence we think that the likely alternative that opening opposition proves fully, other than I don't think O proves these companies leaving or O proving that immigrant workers will fill the gap. But what O does prove is that there will be a change in the business model and at least the cost will drive up, which are reasons enough to explain that the policy will be detrimental to the stakeholder that OG is identifying, and that's why we thought one top half. Let's talk about CG in the debate. So the way we saw CG case is we thought that a significant chunk of the positive case from closing government ended up being a rehashed version of opening government and hence quite similar. For example, the CG explanation for why these chaebols have failed to the South Korean economy because they are massive monopolies, which massive companies which are monopolizing the market by trying to engage in relatively coercive behavior against smaller companies in the market, is explanation that opening government somewhat already makes at Prime Minister by explaining how chaebols work. I do think that there is an additional material from closing government to explain that this might harm other sorts of gender minorities or other economic minorities. So at best it's an additional layer or an additional illustration to the OG case for which groups of people in South Korea might get affected more than other groups of people in South Korea. But again, the problem is that the large argument about why this affects the average middle class person in South Korea is the one that opening government already makes. So at best it's an additional illustration, but it's clearly not enough to outweigh, at least till this point, the crux of the argument that opening government had already made. Uh, then I think there are two parts to the CG extension. The first is the democratic principle. CG explains that it is democratically the right thing to protect the rights of labor. So and I think the thing that CG suggests here specifically is because or you should there's a there's an obligation that states owe to their people, and that obligation can't be fulfilled if you end up giving up on what the labor cares about, because these are uniquely vulnerable groups of people. And I think there's other stuff from closing government, the crux of the argument being that there's a democratic obligation that you have to protect the rights of workers, and on opposition you would end up inevitably trading that off. The problem that we saw with this principle material is it was hard for us to place this in the debate because this is still practical dependent, i.e. it's not this argument cannot work until CG independently proves that the labor actually gets harmed in opposition way more than they get on government. So in which case they are already reliant upon OG's mechanisms for why the labor gets somewhat benefited when you have some more labor unions, and also dependent upon opening opposition's case, or opening opposition's case comes prior to CG's case because it already explains that the labor gets harmed. So if CG's criteria at the end of the day is that the labor itself will get is the one that you should protect because you have a democratic right towards it, then it also explains that the harm on their side might increase per the OO case, because O explains that the labor themselves get harmed much more on government teams once the chaebols have lesser money to pay to their workers, or when they are forced to change their business of model of operations, which is the reason why CG's democratic principle, while it is an additional form of weighing for why labor as a stakeholder matters, it's not very clear whether this is a comparative in the debate, because both top half teams already agree that the labor matters. The debate is on who benefits the labor more. I do think then that the crux of the CG extension actually, which helps them not place fourth, is a lot of good responses which are new in the debate. For example, like CG trying to suggest that CG, I think, giving additional explanations for why the South Korean economy is currently in dire straits, all because of the chaebols. So either suggesting that in South Korea there's a huge culture of you not questioning your seniors, which is the reason why the workers just don't speak up enough, or the fact that because South Korea is so proximate to China and Japan, is the reason why they are competing with the business models of China and Japan, and hence it's a race to the bottom for who can deregulate the labor market the most. Are all explanations at best which explain that the chaebols are the crucial reason why the South Korea is currently deprioritizing worker rights. And hence this is the new material that we credit in the debate in the form of responses that CG lands towards other teams. The problem is, to the at least up until this point, it does not win against top half teams because this is still uncomparative, because it's not very clear whether any of these problems get solved uh, as a consequence of the policy itself. So, one primary reason why OG lost to opening opposition is, at best they prove that more labor unions exist, but it's not clear what the company's response to it. The problem is that the CG's case falls further into that trap because CG still depends upon the power of labor unions and how powerful and how labor unions will end up lobbying with companies, which is the claim that OG already makes. So CG at best ends up proving that the South Korean economy is in dire straits, but does not end up explaining independently beyond the OG mechanisms for how they uniquely benefited. And that's the reason why we thought that CG could not place higher over top half teams. Let's bring closing opposition. So the way we saw again CO is, we thought that a significant chunk of the case was either derivative or assertive. So the portion of the case that is derivative is the stuff about labor costs increasing. And I think Opweb also tries to say this by suggesting that there's a whole extension on CO for why the amount of money that companies would have would reduce over time because labor costs will keep increasing, is material that opening opposition had already flagged and explicitly explained also, and hence we thought that portion was not the relevant portion of the CO case. The relevant portion of the CO case was to explain that in South Korea the business the business environment would it would be significantly, this policy would be significantly detrimental to the business climate in South Korea. The reason why it did not work in the debate is because firstly against closing government, because I think this is close but also not close, is because all of CG's a new material for why the chaebols are bad ends up explaining that the reason why the South Korean economy is currently in dire straits is because of the existence of chaebols. So if closing opposition wanted to suggest that the chaebols and the stability of chaebols is what will end up attracting massive investments into South Korea, it's not very clear whether that's a big enough benefit if closing government is somewhat analytically ahead in pointing out that the chaebols themselves are the reason why the South Korean economy is currently suffering a lot. So what CG does is explain that is give new reasons for why chaebols are bad for the South Korean economy, and closing opposition does not explain why the new investment that comes out of stabilizing the chaebols is more important than all of the harms that they're already creating. In which case we thought that CG's case is somewhat ahead, or at least the new version of the CG case is ahead of the CO case because it identifies the problem of the debate much better than closing opposition, considering that CO does not directly weigh why their problem or their benefit matters more than CG's case. I would obviously flag that the absence of weighing is not the reason why a team automatically loses to the other team, but because it was not evident from closing opposition as to why the amount of money is the amount of money has an actual impact versus all of the harms that CG was talking about in terms of the chaebols harming the South Korean economy. We thought CG was ahead against closing opposition, and that's why CO could not stand against CG. The reason why CO could not win against opening opposition is, first, we thought that a substantial portion of the case was derivative about jobs, and I think is also far more specific about what sorts of jobs or what sorts of portfolios in companies are actually replaced or changed by companies, and hence O makes the version of the jobs argument much better than closing opposition does, other than CO being derivative within that argument. The second thing is that the new material from CO about the business climate in South Korea getting detrimentally getting affected, again, is material that does not have an impact eventually. At best, it proves that the South Korean economy gets more money, but because everybody else in the debate has already agreed that it's the labor as the stakeholder that matters the most, it's not very clear from closing opposition whether a new stakeholder such as the South Korean economy matters more than an explicitly agreed upon stakeholder by three other teams, which is the labor itself. And hence we thought that CO at best might end up getting more money in the South Korean economy, but it's not very clear whether this has an actual impact on the labor, which is the stakeholder of the debate, or whether the South Korean economy matters more than the rights of the labor, which is also what CO does not do, and that's the reason why CO can't win against OO. Finally, against OG, I think the reasoning is quite similar as the one it was against CG, which is CO at best explains that the South Korean economy gets more money, but OG again has independent reasons for why the chaebols are currently harmful, because they engage in monopolistic behavior by locking out smaller companies, and they also have a wide disrespect for labor laws. So, and eventually on the comparative, if you have like stronger labor unions, then at least you have a questioning criteria for these companies. Like, again, it's not evidently clear whether companies will change in a positive manner as a consequence of more scrutiny by labor unions, but at least it is more analysis from more than closing opposition to explain why there is at least some check on bad companies, as opposed to bad companies continuing to run amok within South Korea. So that's how we like thought about CO in the debate, and that's why they placed last. If you have questions, you can ask me.
Can OG get personal feedback, please?
Uh, sure. I mean, I can drop my messenger. You can message me there if that works.
Yeah, that's fine too.
Okay, sure.
Thank you for the
Thank you
way.
so
Can we
much.
message you on Facebook for feedback?
Yeah, all good. All good.
Can we
Okay,
also
thank
do
you.
that?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I will drop it here.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, folks. Good luck.